Hello. I've already done a series of videos on all the kings of Israel and Judah from Rehoboam right through to Jehoiakim. That was really an overview of the books of Kings and Chronicles. If you want to look at those, go to my website, click on the videos tab, and you will find them. But I've never done a series on the events that led up to the formation of the monarchy in Israel and of the first few kings. And that's really a study of 1st and 2nd Samuel. And it's really important because this is where the royal line began that leads to Jesus, the son of David. Did you know that phrase, son of David, occurs in the first verse and the last verse of the New Testament? It's really important. So I want to do this series. Each one will be about 10 minutes long. This one will be a little longer because I've got a bit of introduction. Now, before we go to 1 Samuel, we need to go back a little bit just to get some background of the events that lead up to the formation of the monarchy. And so we're going to look for about 4 talks at the last 3 chapters of the book of Judges and a glance at the book of Ruth. Now, when you come to the last 3 chapters of the book of Judges, that chapter 19, 20, and 21, you come to one of the most convoluted, bizarre, and even shocking stories of the whole Bible. It's a very difficult section to interpret, and at times we're tempted to say, what on earth can we get out of this of value in our Christian lives? Well, we might be surprised. I'm going to assume that you've read those 3 chapters and familiarized yourself with their content, because then you'll get more out of these talks. And so we come to the beginning of our study, and we're going today just to look at Judges chapter 19, verses 1 to 14, a section I've called the Levite and the Concubine. Now, to look at this, we need some geographical background. When Joshua conquered the Promised Land, he divided it into 12 parts and gave one part to each of the tribes of Israel. You might be a bit surprised to see that some of them are much bigger than others. That's partly due to the population of each tribe, partly due to the viability of the land. Some of that land is just desert. Notice that Ephraim is geographically the center of the 12 tribes, and they were the center in another way I'll show you in a moment. Now, these 3 chapters involve all 12 of those tribes, very much so. But our story today only involves the tribes of Ephraim, Benjamin, and Judah. So we're going to zoom in our map and look at those. Now, I said that Ephraim was the geographical center of the 12 tribes, but it was also the spiritual center, because Shiloh was the place where they kept the tabernacle and the Ark of the Covenant and the priestly function. And so it was the spiritual center. And you would have expected Ephraim then to become the most important and ultimately the one that might survive to the present day. But that wasn't so. Judah was the one. And so we can begin our reading. In those days, Israel had no king. Now note that the writer of Judges is aware that these are the events that will lead up to the formation of the monarchy. And so our story begins. A Levite who lived in a remote area of the hill country of Ephraim took a concubine from Bethlehem in Judah. Now let's unpack that verse a little bit. First of all, note a Levite. Now Levites were everybody who belonged to the tribe of Levi. Now, if we look back at our map of the 12 tribes, you will notice something interesting. Levi isn't there. Levi is actually a 13th tribe, and they had no land. They were to live spread right through all the tribes. The tribes were to pay them a tithe so they could live. And they were to fulfill the function, basically, of a local pastor and a local magistrate in every area. They were to be the salt of the earth of the Lord's presence spread through the people of Israel. It didn't always work that way, but it was a wonderful idea. Now, there are 2 levels of Levites. There's ordinary Levites, but then there are what is called the Kohanim. They were the people who were supposed to be directly descended from Aaron. They formed the priesthood. They acted in the temple and gave the sacrifices and so on. They were divided into 12 sections. Each would spend a month and come and do their work at the temple. Zechariah in the Christmas story was one of the Kohanim. But this man was an ordinary Levite. Do you know that both Levites and Kohanim have survived to the present day? I went to school with lots of Jewish children. In my class, there were children with the surname of Levi and children with the surname of Cohen. So there we are, right to the present day. And then we read that this man lived in a remote area in the hill country of Ephraim. Now, the hill country of Ephraim I'll mark on the map. And the further you get from the sea, the more hilly it gets and the drier it gets. Until you get right into the east, it's very hilly and rocky and very dry, just on the edge of the Dead Sea Valley. And this man lived in a remote area of Ephraim, so I presume he lived somewhere northeast of Shiloh. And then we read that he took a concubine from Bethlehem in Judah. Bethlehem is way down in the south, probably about 12 miles into the territory of Judah. Now that word concubine, you know what a concubine is? There was a little boy who came back from Sunday school. His mom said, "What did you learn?" He said, "We learned about Solomon." She said, "Well, what did you learn about Solomon?" Well, he got into trouble because he had 300 wives and 600 porcupines. So I guess Solomon had a prickly problem. Concubines had nothing to do with prostitutes. They were legitimate, legal wives. It's just that they were second-class wives to the other wives. Now, there's the first time when we are really going to grate against the mores of another culture. The mores are the characteristics, habits, attitudes of a culture that define that culture. Now, before we get too judgmental, we need to just remember what Alistair Cook of Letters to America fame said. He said, "We historians must be very careful when evaluating the mores of a bygone era that we don't judge them by the light that we have received." Now, we are completely against polygamy. That's our mores. But in their culture, they weren't. They hadn't received light that was wrong. The whole Old Testament never says polygamy is wrong. Even Jesus doesn't really say it. Only the principles implicit in what he says ultimately have led the church to realize God's standard is one man, one woman for life. But before we get too judgmental on the system of polygamy and of concubines, let me just say two things in mitigation, not defense. Firstly, a woman in that time, if she was single, had absolutely no legal status. She was quite lost and helpless. Now, again, we don't agree with those mores. We have mores where women are supposed to be equal. But they didn't have that. But at least they did have a system of polygamy so that every woman could get married. And in those days when they were always going out to war, many young men got killed and they couldn't find husbands. So it did enable every woman to find a place. At least there was that to it. And then look at the attitude in verse 3 of this particular Levite. It says, he went to her to persuade her to return. Now, she had committed adultery and gone back to her father. And yet he goes, he doesn't demand her. He's not a caveman who hits her over the head with his club and drags her back by the hair. He comes to persuade her. That indicates that she could say no and stay in her father's house. There's a respect there from that man, and I think that was also part of their mores. The better people in their society had respect to women, and the implication is she could have said no. And so this man makes a long journey from the remote area of Ephraim all the way down to Bethlehem. That journey is very evocative, isn't it, of another couple who made that journey from Nazareth when she was great with child. And that's made even more evocative, that journey, by T.S. Eliot's wonderful poem, The Journey of the Magi. A hard coming we had of it. Well, he gets to his father-in-law's house, and a very bizarre sequence of events takes place. He stays there 3 days, and on the 4th day he wants to leave, but the father-in-law says, "No, don't leave, let's eat and drink and have a good time together until lunchtime." And then he says, "Now I want to go." "No, it's afternoon now, stay another night." And so he stays another night. And the next morning he's ready to leave, and the father-in-law again says, "No, let's eat and drink a little more." And I think there's an implication of quite a lot of alcohol here. And finally, at lunch on the 5th day, the man says, "I really must go." Now, what's going on here? And it's important that we understand this. Here we are encountering one of the mores of their society, that hospitality was an extremely high virtue. You must offer hospitality to a stranger, and that's a wonderful thing in a dry and thirsty land like that. And you must receive the hospitality. So that is why this Levite is so unwilling to say no. The man is saying stay, and he doesn't want to be bad-mannered and say, "I must go." Eventually he does. But it's important that we understand the high status in which hospitality is held, because that's going to play a very important part in the story later on. Well, eventually in verse 10, he does leave, and we read, "Unwilling to stay another night, the man left and went towards Jebus," which is Jerusalem. Now this is really interesting. It was not called Jerusalem at that time because it had never been conquered. And so I'll put a little ring around it. It's still lived in by Jebusites who are living in fair peace with the Israelites around them. There's a good reason why Jebus was never conquered, because it is in the perfect position if you want to build a defensible city. It's got steep hills around it, easy to defend, and it's got natural springs that flow all year round, exactly what you want if you're going to be under siege. So they never did defeat it. It was only defeated 100 years later by David. Now you'll notice that Jebus is right on the border between Benjamin and Judah. And later it became a bit of a debate exactly where did Jebus fall, because it became important, became Jerusalem. Now here we see a picture of Jerusalem as we know it today. Now in this picture we're seeing it from the air and from the north. And you see the Dome of the Rock there. Well, that is where Solomon eventually built his temple. And when he built it, on the west side of it, he built the Holy of Holies. And it became agreed that the division between Judah and Benjamin would run right through the temple, dividing the Holy of Holies from the open court. And so the Holy of Holies, it became accepted, was in Judah, and the outer courts were in Benjamin. Now, if you look down to the left, you'll see an area where you see a great crowd of people. Well, that is what's known as the Western Wall. There it is up close. That is the closest that Jewish people can get to where the Holy of Holies used to be. Jewish people are not allowed up on the Temple Mount. Now, Orthodox Jews believe that God's presence has never left the place of the Holy of Holies. They just call it the presence. And in the last 30 years, they've dug a tunnel all the way from the Western Wall right along the foundation of Herod's retaining wall. And right in the middle there is the closest that a Jew can get to the holy place. We've walked through there, and you find a few plastic stools, and you will find some Orthodox Jews praying there in the closest place they can get to the presence of the Lord. And it's traditional for Orthodox brides to go down through that tunnel with their wedding dress, and it doesn't matter if it gets dirty in the tunnels and so on. That's actually a sign of honor. It's a sign that I prayed as close as I could to the holy place before coming to my wedding. And so the Levite arrives at Jebus, and his servant says to him, "It's already coming on evening, let's stay here." And in verse 10 he gives a fateful answer. He says, "No, we won't go into any city whose people are not Israelites. We will go on to Gibeah." And that is a fateful decision, a very ironic one, because he says, "I won't stay among these strangers. I won't feel safe. I'll go to Gibeah." And my word, how wrong he is. It's very easy for us to judge strangers as less safe, less good, as less desirable than the people we know. And so he pushes on, and we read in verse 14, "So they went on, and as the sun set, they came to Gibeah in Benjamin, and thereby hangs a tale." This will lead to an incident that will rock the 12 tribes of Israel to their foundations and threaten to tear it apart, and ultimately will lead to the formation of the monarchy. And that's the subject of the next talk.